It was a quiet April morning in Teddington, England. The phone rang, and rang, and rang again. No one answered. When they finally opened the door to his flat, they found him exactly where he always was, sitting in his armchair, the television still on, the room undisturbed. Benny Hill, the man who had made the entire world laugh, had died alone, no family beside him, no final curtain call, no farewell, and on the very same day his body was discovered, an envelope sat unopened on his doorstep. Inside it, a brand new television contract, a second chance, an invitation back to the stage he had been torn from 3 years earlier. He never got to open it. This is not just the story of a canceled television show. This is the story of a man who gave the world his laughter and kept his tears entirely to himself. A man whose comedic empire stretched across 140 countries, yet who died in a rented flat, mending his own worn-out clothes because he couldn't bring himself to buy new ones. But before we get to that quiet, heartbreaking morning in April, we need to go back to the sketch that lit the fuse, back to the moment the world decided it had finally had enough of Benny Hill. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was not born into glamour. He arrived on January 21st, 1924, in Southampton, Hampshire, a modest English port city that smelled more salt water and hard work than spotlights and applause. His father ran a surgical appliance shop. Practical, unremarkable, but dig one generation further back, and something interesting surfaces. His grandfather, Henry Hill, had been a circus clown. Perhaps that's where it started, that inherited instinct to make people laugh, that genetic pull toward the absurd. Benny, a name he would later adopt as a tribute to his idol, the American comedian Jack Benny, did not walk a straight path to stardom. He stocked shelves at Woolworth's. He delivered milk in the early morning darkness. He operated a bridge, drove trucks, and even played drums in a band. Each job a different costume, a different character, training, though he didn't know it yet, for a life spent becoming other people. When World War II arrived, Hill was called up and trained as a mechanic with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. He was deployed to Normandy in September 1944, landing in the mud and chaos of one of history's most consequential military campaigns. He drove trucks. He operated searchlights. He kept the machinery of war running in the dark. But it was his transfer to the Combined Services Entertainment Division, performing comedy for exhausted, homesick soldiers, that quietly changed everything. In those makeshift theaters, performing for men who desperately needed a laugh, Benny Hill learned something essential. He learned that comedy wasn't just entertainment. It was medicine. It was survival. He never forgot that lesson. By 1947, Hill had found his footing on BBC Radio, winning over listeners with sharp wit and elastic timing. But radio, for a man who thought in pictures, was always going to be a stepping stone. When television arrived and handed him a visual canvas, something remarkable happened. Benny Hill came alive. On January 15, 1955, the Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC. What followed was nothing short of a comedic revolution. Hill built a world entirely his own, rapid-fire slapstick, layered double entendres, dead-on celebrity impressions, an arsenal of recurring characters that audiences fell deeply in love with. There was Fred Scuttle, the bumbling, saluting little man who could reduce a studio audience to tears of laughter with a single expression. There was Jackie Wright, tiny, bald, and perpetually dignified, whose stoic face absorbed Hill's infamous head slaps with the patience of a saint and the timing of a genius. And then there were the chases, those gloriously unhinged madcap end-of-show chase sequences, Hill and his entire cast hurtling through parks and corridors and seaside promenades, filmed at undercrank speed, so the footage played back faster than life, more ridiculous than reality, set to the bouncing, irresistible brass of yakety sax. These sequences became arguably the most recognizable comedic signature in the history of British television. In 2015, that piece of music was voted the #1 TV theme in an ITV special, a piece of comedy so powerful it outlived the controversy that tried to bury it. When the show moved to Thames Television in 1969, it ascended to a different stratosphere entirely. 1-hour specials replaced weekly episodes, giving Hill room to stretch, to experiment, to build sketches of real cinematic scale. The numbers that followed were staggering. Over 21 million viewers in 1971 alone, making it one of the most watched programs in British television history. Then came the international explosion. The Benny Hill Show was broadcast in over 140 countries. In America, it was syndicated across network television. Emmy nominations followed in 1980 and 1981, a Rose d'Or Award in 1984, a BAFTA for Best Writer in 1972. The little boy from Southampton who had won stacked shelves at Woolworths had become one of the most watched entertainers on the planet. But fame, as it so often does, had been quietly building a trap. The 1980s brought change to television, to culture, and to the invisible threshold of what audiences were willing to accept as harmless fun. Hill introduced Hill's Angels to the show, a dance troupe of young women whose presence added energy and physicality to the program's increasingly elaborate production. The sketches grew bigger. The budget swelled, each episode now costing £450,000 to produce. But as the spectacle expanded, the criticism grew louder. What had once been dismissed as cheeky, seaside postcard humor, bawdy but innocent, risque but toothless, was being looked at through new eyes. And those eyes were no longer amused. The sketch that crystallized everything aired in the late 1980s. A parody of a beauty pageant. Women displayed and ogled and reduced the props in a joke that landed not with a laugh, but with a thud. Critics didn't just call it unfunny. They called it a symptom, a reflection of something uglier underneath the comedy. And in the charged cultural atmosphere of late 80s Britain, that was a distinction that mattered enormously. Then came Ben Elton. Ben Elton was the sharpest, loudest voice of alternative British comedy, a movement that had grown in direct opposition to everything the Benny Hill Show represented. And in January 1987, speaking on Saturday Live and in the pages of Q magazine, Elton didn't just criticize Benny Hill. He accused him. He argued that Hill's portrayal of women, chaste, objectified, reduced to decorative targets of male desire, was not merely offensive. It was dangerous. That it contributed to a culture in which women felt unsafe walking the streets alone. The accusation detonated. Supporters of Hill fought back hard. One writer in The Independent compared Elton's attack to watching an elderly uncle being kicked to death by young thugs. Brutal, disproportionate, cruel. Others pointed to the absurdity of blaming a slapstick comedy program for crimes against women, comparing the logic to holding concert pianists responsible for elephant poaching. But the damage was done. Not because Elton was necessarily right, but because the cultural conversation had shifted, and the Benny Hill Show was now standing on the wrong side of it. Thames Television looked at the declining ratings. They looked at the £450,000 per episode price tag. They looked at the advertising revenue shrinking as audiences drifted away. And in 1989, after 21 years in a partnership that had earned the network an estimated £26 million, they made their decision. The Benny Hill Show was canceled. Quietly, without ceremony. Hill was reportedly informed not in a formal meeting, not with the dignity his decades of service had earned, but through an intermediary, a phone call, a door closed without a proper goodbye. He attempted a comeback with Benny Hill's World Tour in 1991, but completed only a single special, Greetings from New York, before his health began to fail. A mild heart attack struck in February 1992. Doctors recommended bypass surgery. He refused. Kidney failure followed. He refused dialysis too. It was as though, having been pushed off the stage he had built with his own hands, he had simply decided to stop fighting. On the morning of April 20th, 1992, Benny Hill sat down in his armchair in his rented Teddington flat and watched television. The same flat he had chosen over owning a home, because owning things had never seemed important to him. The same man who bought cheap food from supermarkets, who walked instead of taking taxis, who patched his clothes rather than replacing them, despite sitting on an estate worth over £7.5 million. He had proposed marriage twice in his life. Both women had said no. He had no children. And in his final years, stripped of the show that had defined him, he had retreated into an isolation that those around him found deeply troubling. He died alone, peacefully, the records say. Coronary thrombosis. His body wasn't discovered for 2 days. And on that doorstep, that cruel, ironic detail that history has never quite let go of, sat a letter from Central Independent Television. A new contract, a new beginning, arriving 2 days too late. In November 2021, the Benny Hill Show returned to British television for the first time in nearly 20 years. Featured in a Christmas schedule alongside other beloved classics, audiences rediscovered the sketches. The laughter came back easily, instinctively, because great comedy, whatever its era, whatever its controversy, carries within it something essentially human. The debate about Benny Hill's legacy, about where the line between harmless fun and harmful representation truly lies, has never fully been resolved. Perhaps it never will be. These are not simple questions, and they deserve more than simple answers. But what is beyond debate is this. A boy from Southampton, carrying his grandfather's clown blood and his father's quiet dignity, spent his entire life trying to make the world laugh. He succeeded beyond any measure he could have imagined. He made 21 million people forget their troubles on a Tuesday evening. He crossed language barriers, cultural borders, and decades of changing taste. And at the end of it all, he sat alone in a rented armchair, watching television, in a flat he never owned. The world had laughed with him for 40 years. It just never quite learned to look after him.